Good morning, Vietnam, and here I am back again doing my latest video, and I am going to do a deep dive into what I believe is one of the biggest hoaxes of all time, and that is, does HIV and AIDS exist? Well, first of all, it's going to be 4 parts and they're going to be quite long each, so I've split it up into 4 to make it a little bit more acceptable. But if you don't want to listen to me as I run through my notes on screen, in the initial description, when you open my video, you will see 4 or 5 references that I will use extensively to discuss this controversy. So you don't have to listen to me if you don't want to. You can read these 4 articles. They're quite long in themselves, but you can do your own research from them and more or less cover maybe 30% of what I will be covering. But it will give you enough information from the beginning if you really want to see how I disprove any statements made by scientists and researchers to justify and prove that AIDS and HIV exist. That being said, I noticed a few days ago when I was finishing my research and preparing the presentation that I have done many videos. Most of my videos, in fact, are about lies. People telling lies. There's people on YouTube, quite a few, and I've really criticized 2 of them for telling lies to the people, to the public, and to the YouTube audience, where they have absolutely zero business doing. And you can check them out if you like. Also, all the other videos, one is on the media failures, the other is on wartime massacres, and another major one is on US presidents and their lies. So quite a few about lies, and this one is, I realized, no exception. So I'm going to mention 3 occurrences. One is about a drug in Germany that was introduced in the late 50s, early 60s, and that drug is called thalidomide. And the drug was introduced to the public as an anxiety drug, mainly to women. I remember growing up in Australia in the late 60s, especially early 70s, that aspirin was taken by Australian housewives to a large extent, because obviously they were having their anxiety attacks as well. But thalidomide, it turns out, if a pregnant woman took it, there was a high probability that the children, the babies, would be deformed. And it was an absolute catastrophe how many babies were deformed. So they immediately pulled it off the market, of course. And years and years and years and years later, they settled from class action lawsuits, of course. The other thing is that the drug was never tested on pregnant women. The second item I'll bring up is powder that is used by men and women as a deodorant, and Johnson & Johnson was a major manufacturer of powder. I recall I even used it in the beginning. But it turns out, because of the talc in the powder, that women were starting to use it around their genitals. And as it turned out, they started developing cancers around their genitals. And it took, again, probably 2 decades after it was discovered the cause of this. And of course, Johnson & Johnson denied it to the hilt. And they, after some major class action lawsuits, they finally settled. The third one I'll bring up is also an American one, and that is the the Ford Bronco, the first one, which was about as garbage as a vehicle as you can possibly get, that was sold to the public, and it was a death trap. And there was two reasons. One was that because it was so top heavy and the suspension was so badly and cheaply designed and manufactured, it tended to roll over. So to decrease the rollover tendency, they, they made the roof lightweight. So if you happen to roll over, there's a good chance you would get hurt, and quite badly. The second reason they were rolling over, I don't know if you recall this is in the 90s, early 90s, or in the 90s, I believe, when it all came to light, was the tire pressure. And Ford asked Firestone to decrease the tire pressure down to something like 25 psi. Almost all automobiles today run on around 32 psi. And that decreased the height of the Bronco to try and limit the rollover tendency. The problem is, in southern states where it's also very hot, a lot of accidents were occurring because at high speeds on the highways, the tires would overheat and burst. And of course, then you would get rollovers occasionally, and many people died. And again, there was major lawsuits. Of course, Ford, the junk company it has been and always will be the last 50 years, it blamed Firestone for the tires being at low pressure. But of course, it was Ford that asked them to drop the pressure so low. And actually, it bankrupted Firestone. And they were sold, I believe, to Bridgestone, a Japanese company. Anyway, these are all the lies these companies, lack of research, that were given to the public, and look how many people have died and deformed babies, and disgusting. So that brings us to HIV and AIDS. And now I'm going to put my notes on the screen, and there's about 25 pages of notes, some in large font, of course. But I'm not going to go through every little bit of the notes, but basically the notes will show the amount of research I've done. And this is only the first video, which is called The Beginnings, when so-called AIDS, HIV, was discovered back in 82, 83. And the following articles and the propaganda that followed that try to convince the public of this epidemic, and how the few reasons, especially in the 80s, early 80s, mid 80s, late 80s, they try to convince the public how HIV, how the virus got to or within human beings, and that it was going to become an international epidemic, and millions of people were going to die. So the first one's will be the beginnings of HIV. The second one will be on just the general overall history of HIV, and the many articles I've researched will come on the screen, and I'm not going to go through every one in detail as I have in my notes, but generally I will only read my own notes, analysing these articles in the good, the bad and ugly of how the article is written, the words they use, and any backup for the article and research that they provide within the article. The third one will be on the drugs that have been prescribed for HIV and AIDS, and there's quite a distinction between the two, which I'll get into immediately once I start the main part of this video. And the main drug they initially, I think, was approved in 87, was AZT, which in fact is pure poison. So I have a whole video on that, and the other drugs and the unbelievable side effects of every drug they've prescribed for HIV. And then the final one, I'm doing a critique on Dr. Gallo and his rebuttal of an article in 2005 written by Celia Farber. And it's a long rebuttal. As I said, it's like almost all these, the 4 videos, my notes are about 25 pages long. And every time I look into an article, I have to sidetrack to research another part of what the article has said. And so they get quite long. But Gallo was one of the originators, who the original partnership of him and a French scientist, and they're considered the co-finders of HIV and AIDS, discoverers. But Gallo tried to discredit this article by Celia Farber, and she's a journalist, only a journalist, not a scientist at all, but she probably knows more about HIV and AIDS than 90% of scientists, even those who have studied it. And she started writing these articles in Spin magazine initially in 1987. And she wrote a number of articles, and Spin continued to write articles about this epidemic and the falsity of it, of course, and also did a great article on AZT. So that'll be my final video, and how I believe badly Gallo tries to discredit Ms. Farber's article in Nature magazine. So that being said, I am going to pause my video, and I did not pause it, so I'm trying. I'm back again, and on the screen now is the beginning of my notes on part 1, which you can see is the beginnings, and the title is, of course, HIV, Is It a Hoax? Now, as I said, you can just look at the description on YouTube and look at the 4 articles that I've listed there, and you can read those and you can make a decision if you want to listen to me talk about all my research and have a look at all the articles that I have looked at, read, and found where they are not satisfying, in my opinion, real scientific research and proving anything. So each one I'm going to start with this quote from Mahatma Gandhi. An error can never become true, however many times you repeat it. The truth can never be wrong, even if no one ever hears about it. So, as I noted here, the emphasis, if I want to make an emphasis in any of the articles, I highlight it in red. Almost all my comments are in capitals and generally in red, and occasionally a different color. And I'll try and go through this as fast as possible. As I said, it's 26 pages long on this first part on the beginnings. So, one of the main issues I have always had, especially after COVID-19 outbreak, a real virus, is that the institutions were able to track down people with the virus and place them in quarantine for up to 14 days. Now, this actually happened to a good friend of mine in Vietnam. He was in a bar, and someone in the bar was tested positive. So they found out everyone who was in the bar, and they put him in a hotel for, I believe, 10 days. So why was this never done in the beginning, or in fact any time, as far as I know and can tell, with HIV? And I believe because once they started doing any real research and backup and trying to confirm anything about HIV other than what the premises they had already established and wanted to prove, then anything that can prove otherwise they wouldn't do. Now, I've been following this since the 1980s, and I have to say I always thought it was a lie, mainly because the 4 or 5 stories they were telling us in the early to mid to late 80s, or the 80s, just seemed so far-fetched that they had to be all made up. So it's like listening, as I say later, to ex-President Trump talk about how to deal with COVID-19. I mean, they're just talking through their asses. So I'm going to get to these 4 or 5 reasons later in this video, and how they try to convince us that HIV really exists. They also said at the time that millions and millions of people were going to die. Well, I don't know if that really happened because, as I say later, there is no real proof of how many people have died of AIDS. Sorry, AIDS caused by HIV. So, I don't know how many people, I've read so many articles that 10 million people have died, 40 million people have died, and so forth and so forth. And as I say, where is the correlated unbiased proof? How is the data collected? Who's collected it? Definitely no one has, and no international body has. They just put out these numbers and they want you to believe it. Birth certificates. Who's doing that? There's no, I haven't read any article that even mentions collecting birth certificates, or death certificates, sorry, about why people die if they are dying of pneumonia, as I mentioned here. What do people die of? AIDS. Your body has an immunity deficiency. That is why you die. A disease like pneumonia. And in fact, most people who die of AIDS, so-called die of AIDS, have pneumonia. Other diseases, main diseases, are TB and severe bronchial infections, other than pneumonia, which is AIDS, of course. And what is AIDS? It's an immunity deficiency. You get pneumonia first, then you may or may not get tested for HIV. Any disease you die of, and there are many illnesses that may destroy your T-cell count. It depends on your immunity system at the time, what your T-cell count is. And now they're saying if you're below 200, your T-cell count is below 200, then you definitely have AIDS from HIV. So what I was saying, excuse me, what I was saying is your T-cell count, they're actually your CD4 plus white blood cells. These are the blood cells you need to fight infections. And with HIV and AIDS, the main causes that they're attributing to HIV and AIDS is a bronchial infection, or in other words, bronchitis, pneumonia, a lot to do with your lungs. And what they do at the on your death certificate is they say you have died of pneumonia, but caused by complications due to AIDS. Now, as I write, but where is the proof? How many autopsies were done once you've been assigned to have AIDS and HIV? How many autopsies were done to prove exactly what you died of? Because as we'll get into later, a little bit in this video and in the second last video about the AIDS test, and also your CD4 count. Just having a low CD4 plus count does not mean you have AIDS. there are many illnesses you can get where your CD4 white cell count drops alarmingly low. So then what do you have? And also with the test, if anyone's followed it, has also evolved, because each test they've had to modify and the parameters within it, because as the time went by, the tests weren't giving the answers they wanted, so they then changed the parameters of the test. And suddenly there's only one company left that the US government has allowed to be used to test for HIV. And why is that the case? We don't know, because I cannot find any information. So as I say, they could simply be dying of, as they were before, of a bronchial infection, until AIDS became a cause célèbre. So how many people do not get a blood test for HIV? Now, they try to force on you to get a test if you are in one of those 4 so-called H compromised groups. And they keep talking about the narrative of these 4H groups, and how you must, even if your so-called CD4 count after taking some of their horrific drugs has actually gone up, it's actually been found that after a period of 3-6 months, your CD4 plus count goes back down. And then you get all these other complications. But they keep thinking and talking and writing that you should be getting tested every 6 months. Well, if you're dying after that initial 6 months, especially after the early people taking AZT, you're dying anyway. So what would be the point of doing an HIV test? So why? Why do they want you to get tested? They don't get you tested for any other virus regularly. I mean, once you get herpes, that's it. You've got herpes for life, because they haven't developed a vaccine to kill the virus. I mean, they had to find a cure for COVID-19, mainly because it's an airborne, and it was affecting the whole world, and they went all out and developed a vaccine within months. So now we finally get on to the beginnings. The discovery of HIV. Now, supposedly, as written up by all the research, and 40 years later, if you've been following this at all, it was discovered by a scientist called Montagnier, and with the help of 2 other French scientists. And this guy, Dr. Rosenberg, talked to Montagnier and said he'd come across a mysterious new syndrome. And that is that the immunity system of some gay men that he'd been studying had immunity deficiency. And they assumed at that time that it was only a gay-related immune deficiency. So, and then Rosenberg suggested it might be a retrovirus. And we'll discuss that soon. So Montagnier and his team examined samples taken from Rosenbaum's AIDS patients in '83 and found the virus that would later become known as HIV in a lymph node biopsy. They named it lymphadenopathy associated virus, or LAV, and later it became HIV. Since as they write in this article, as they wrote in their report, since it was not then clear that it was the cause of AIDS, but they still published their findings, extremely limited findings, on the 20th of May 1983. And as you can see on the screen, I quote from a scientist, which I'll discuss very soon. The enzyme responsible became known as reverse transcriptase, and a lot of new myths arose. And the scientist's name is Stefan Lanka. And he claims, and if you do research, cross-check, and everything you can possibly find on the internet, this seems to be totally true. This, in fact, is all they found. Reverse transcriptase. That is not a retrovirus. And this was proven conclusively back in 1970. But for some reason, it totally confused them, and they didn't use logic, and they didn't go back to 1970, which is only 13 years before they published their paper. As I write and quote from Stefan Lanka again. So they already knew that gay men had immunity deficiencies, but did not pursue this avenue further. Why? How did they become this way? Sorry, this is a quote by me. This is what I'm writing. This has always been my belief. Gay men take drugs, mostly nitrates, become highly immunity deficient, and then they die. And while they're dying, their immunity system gets worse and worse and worse. And this is now a quote from Lanka. They concluded the role of the virus in the etiology, which is medical cause, of AIDS remains to be determined. So again, they've published this article, but they still don't know what caused AIDS, even though they named it LAV. And this is from the report by Montagnier. Isolation of T lymphotropic retrovirus from a patient at risk for acquired immunity deficiency syndrome, and also isolation of human T-cell leukemia virus in acquired immune deficiency syndrome. Both of these are absolute lies. But they went ahead and published, didn't do the research on the few patients they have, and in fact, a number of times they mentioned that there is only one patient. And they totally neglected the fact that in 1970, they clearly showed what a retrovirus really is. So here is my research on retroviruses. There's no date on it, even though it's co-published by the National Institute of Health, and it cites research from 88 to 95. And as it states here in red, as normal genetic elements in their chromosomal DNA. In other words, there's nothing irregular about a retrovirus. So you get your internal, the endogenous, and you have the external, exogenous retroviruses. So to read, so you get the internally transmitted, and then you have your externally transmitted, and I read, and as horizontally transmitted infectious RNA containing viruses which are transmitted from human to human, exogenous retroviruses, example HIV and human T-cell leukemia virus, and comma HTLV. Well, from my reading, HIV and HTLV are the same thing that it was espoused by Montagnier and their initial research, and has been this distinction has been followed and researched and presented for the last 40 years. Why? And I write, why are they separating HTLV and HIV? They are more or less by definition, by scientists, on everything I've read, the same thing. And they are saying now that there are two viruses. So we'll get to the T-cell leukemia virus later. This article goes on. Endogenous retroviruses in animals and humans probably evolved from transposable elements. Some of them gaining the ability to package themselves in a variant structure, in other words, a capsule, leave the cell and infect another cell. Why aren't they mentioning viruses, what I consider real viruses, and everyone else knows that they are real viruses, hepatitis C or COVID-19? Because it's biased. More. In general, endogenous human retroviruses are not pathogenic, and many of them are not complete viruses. And the human genome contains 100 to 1,000 copies of such viruses. So actually, they haven't discovered anything. These endogenous, the ones we have inside us, are already abundant in our bodies, and also they're trying to distinguish between this and T-cell leukemia virus. But in fact, that's what the T-cell leukemia virus is. It's already in our bodies. As I write later, cancer is not transferable. Anyway, you cannot catch cancer. So that whole T-cell lymphoma and the sample they took is, again, a big fat lie. So also endogenous viruses in reproductive tissues of humans without any apparent pathology, the cause of the disease. So we have these viruses, as I said, in our body. You have 100 to 1,000 of these, and yet they don't cause a disease unless they go 100% haywire and it converts to cancer. So here we go. Human T-cell leukemia viruses are horizontally transmitted from human to human. That is exogenous virus, and are associated with development of some rare diseases. They are believed to have originated from highly related simian virus. Another absolute non-connection. They are similar, not highly related. We'll discuss the simian connection later. Then why hasn't there been any epidemics about this connection if they originated from them? But they're claiming that HIV originated from monkeys. Even if they were, how did they get into humans? Going back to the original article, what are they talking about? You have a handful of people in France. How did they get this so-called virus? No background, no research, no tracing, zero. So now we have that sample taken from the lymph node. Human T-cell lymphotropic viruses. This is dated just last year. So it's well up to date on lymphotropic viruses. So this yields a relatively low viral application rate with high fidelity of transcription. What I said right in the beginning, what they found was something that already occurs in our body naturally. The result is a stable genetic product, sharply dissimilar to that of HIV. So, the original statements they made about the taking that sample and basing so much of their report and conclusions that AIDS is caused by HIV in the lymph node biopsy. So, as it says here, the result is a stable genetic product, sharply dissimilar to that of HIV. That means it's a total lie. Now, further down, commonly encountered opportunistic organisms include pneumonia, basically, causing PCP pneumonia, often seen in AIDS patients. As it says in the beginning of this paragraph, the most common of these is the acute type. And clinical features include skin lesions, bone pain caused by hypocalcemia and lytic bone lesions. I mean, this is extremely rare acute cases. But they still go on and make because Pneumocystis jirovecii, often seen in AIDS patients. Again, and now also Cryptococcus neoformans causing occult meningitis. I mean, these are extremely rare diseases. If they were so common in AIDS patients, then we would have read a lot more about this PCP. Again, I'm making the statement. AIDS is, as the name implies, an immunity deficiency. Pneumonia, again, the main cause of people dying that are immunity compromised. Everything up to date, if you can see what I see, is all conjecture. No proof of anything on how they're reaching these conclusions. They're just pulling them out of the air and not going back and doing their correct research as scientists. A virus does not cause cancer on its own. Okay, and a virus that you have acquired externally cannot cause cancer. Cancer is caused internally by your internal mechanism. Your immunity deficiency has gone haywire. Your internal viruses you already have, that causes cancer. Back to the original article by Montagnier. Footnotes 13 and 14 are only obituaries. 15 is a fluff piece on the French female scientist, and 16 is another fluff piece on the French female scientist. So now we get to 17, which is a reference to this article, and it's dated May 1983, which is amazing because this is 10 days before Montagnier published his piece. How did they get all this information 10 days and publish it 10 days before Montagnier? Shouldn't this have come after it? Why? A retrovirus belonging to the family of recently discovered human T-cell leukemia viruses, but clearly distinct from each previous isolate sample, has been isolated from a Caucasian patient with signs and symptoms that often precede AIDS. How did they even know all this? AIDS was just penned in as a name. And it clearly says distinct from other isolates. And the T-cell leukemia virus is, again, inside your body already. It's not a retrovirus. And I discuss retroviruses later. This virus is typical cRNA tumor virus. Buds from the cell membrane, prefers magnesium for reverse transcriptase activity. And it's exactly what they discovered was this: reverse transcriptase activity. They didn't find anything new, except now they're saying HTLV, which is has a blood sample antigen of P24, but now they're saying what they found was P25, which is, I don't know, 99.9% exactly the same. So antibodies from serum of this patient, again, one patient, who knows what disease he had. Reading in red, the virus from this patient has been transmitted into cord blood lymphocytes. And the virus produced by these cells is similar to the original isolate. Proof. From these studies, no studies, it's one patient, a few blood tests, that was it. And it concluded they are T lymphotropic retroviruses that are horizontally transmitted in humans and may be involved in several pathological syndromes, including AIDS. What a absolute 100% lie. They're linking cancer already with the virus, which is 100% a lie. So here are some quotes from this article, which I go into discussing the whole article in greater depth in the next video. So Stephen Lanka is a German microbiologist, and he wrote this article in 1995. And it's the best article. I've listed it in the description at the beginning of this video. If you don't want to listen to me talk for well over an hour, then again, as I said in the beginning of this video, please read this article. A little virology. He heads paragraphs by certain headings. None of these has been characterized and shown to exist as an entity which one may justifiably call a virus. In other words, what he's saying is that no research, this is by 1995, 12 years later, has shown, and even to date, nobody has shown that this so-called HIV virus can exist and they can reproduce it in any level, any way on its own. So therefore, it cannot be a virus. And at the top of it, this paragraph, less well known is the existence of other particles which look like viruses but aren't, and are nonchalantly referred to as virus-like particles. Such particles are far from rare, for example, always in placentas. So again, these are all in our bodies. Another heading, one root of the belief in the AIDS virus. In 1970, an enzyme, biological catalyst, was discovered in extracts of certain cells which was capable of converting a molecule of RNA into DNA. This is what, keep forgetting his name, Stephen Lanka has said is their first biggest mistake is that all they discovered was reverse transcriptase, that converting a molecule from RNA into DNA. Now, I'm not a scientist. I don't know what that means 100% clearly, but the process I understand and the mistakes that Montagnier makes are very clear to me. That's reading now for the last month all these different articles, this is the biggest mistake they made. An error of the past, cancer caused by viruses. So it was believed that the new enzyme was a marker for a virus because the cells in which it was detected and which were used to study cancer were thought to have become cancerous through being infected with a virus. New to the idea of cancer viruses was that nucleic acid when in the form of RNA could be converted to DNA by the enzyme, thus providing a mechanism for viral nucleic acid to be inserted anywhere in the chromosome of the cells. These new viruses became known as retroviruses. The insertion of certain retroviral genes was thought to trigger cancer. But, interestingly, the spread of cancer viruses was blamed on homosexuals, prostitutes, and black people, just as AIDS came to be 13 years later. Well, we've got to find the scapegoat somewhere, so let's pick the same ones every time. Whenever and wherever reverse transcriptase activity was detected, it was rationally assumed that retroviruses were at work. This turned out to be a grave error because it was later found that the enzyme occurred in all living matter, proving that reverse transcriptase activity had nothing to do with retroviruses. So, cancer caused by viruses. Again, I've looked this up because more information keeps becoming available to double check. In this article, it's titled 8 Viruses That Can Increase Your Cancer Risk. There are only 2 viruses that are retroviruses, you'll see below, and that is HIV and HTLV, both from the original research. And the heading, subheading, cancer is also a complex disease with many factors that can affect its development. This makes it tricky to say that a virus directly causes cancer. And this article is 2019. It's more accurate to think of viruses as one contributing factor in the development of cancer. Nowhere in this article does it say, except, let's finish first. Number 4 is HIV. That is 8 viruses that can increase your cancer risk. It's important to note that HIV doesn't cause cancer by itself. The immune system is important in both fighting infections and in finding and attacking cancerous cells. But remember, the original article said that HIV, that cancer they found in the lymph node, was caused by HIV. The weakening of the immune system caused by HIV infection can increase the risk, but it doesn't mean that HIV causes cancer. Can increase the risk of developing certain types of cancers, such as Kaposi sarcoma or non-Hodgkin lymphoma and cervical cancer. Most of these causes has been totally debunked or greatly exaggerated. Example, the main cause of KP, especially in gay men, is their high use of nitrates to get high so they can get a higher experience while they're having sex. But even in 2019, they're still claiming this. Even though it says HIV doesn't cause cancer by itself. HTLV, as a retrovirus, and it's already, I talk about retroviruses soon, as a retrovirus, part of the HTLV's life cycle involves integrating viral genes into those of the host cell. This may affect how the cell grows or expresses its genes and can potentially lead to cancer. Potentially lead. It doesn't lead to cancer, it can potentially lead to cancer. Many people with HTLV infections have no symptoms. However, HTLV infection is associated with an aggressive type of cancer cell called acute T-cell leukemia lymphoma. It's estimated 2 to 5% of people with the virus will develop ATL. If you get HTLV. But HIV, in my opinion, from what all the writings I've read, is HTLV. Please note my emphasis in red on the 2 viruses. None of the other 6 viruses have language even closely resembling the way they talk about HTLV and HIV. All the other viruses are very direct, have been proved again and again. The other 6, everyone knows that they are connected to cancers. But the language used in these 2 should give anyone pause to keep researching and show that it's just not proven. So, they did not trace his movements, the original guy in the original article, how he came to have so-called AIDS and cancer. Why was his immunity system shot? Where was he before this? One patient, again, what craziness. They already know he's very sick with leukemia. So how did they know the leukemia did not cause the patient's sickness on its own? Where did the virus come from? Cancer is not transmissible. This is one of the real keys to the beginning of this controversy. A virus does not show up by itself. It's either airborne like COVID-19 or transmitted like herpes. So what was this virus? And I postulate it never existed in the first place. Then all the narrative and the use of certain language since then, and the words used as I've just shown in the 8 viruses that can cause a cancer risk. The words used in those 2, to me, is despicable. The statements, obfuscations, confusing tests, finding the virus from thin air, all to prove something that their conclusion is valid, even though the logic and the tests were either inconclusive or wrong. Now, I finally mention the culling of 40,000 elephants because of so-called expertise. I mentioned 3 in the beginning of this video. The thalidomide case, the Ford Bronco case, and the forgotten the third one. I'll think of it. So-called experts. Oh, Johnson & Johnson with the talc powder that gave women genital cancers. The so-called experts and approvals by government officers like the FDA. One of the saddest stories I read recently in the last couple of years was the culling of 40,000 elephants by some white guy scientist who studied grazing lands in Africa, and he was trying to save the grazing lands because when the elephant herds went through them, they stamped the grasses down. So his conclusion was, if we get rid of the elephants, then the grasses will grow naturally back and not be stamped down, and that will leave grasslands for all the other animals. But his logic was so wrong. Why is it then that there's so many, the diversity of animals all through Central and Southern Africa is so great, and all the elephants have existed with these animals over the last thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. They've been able to live together, and none of them died off. So his logic, it was so flawed that he concluded that if we kill the elephants, then the grasses won't get flattened, and therefore all the animals will survive better. Well, he killed all the animals, elephants, 40,000 he killed, and then he realized that the flattening of the grasses allowed the rejuvenation of the grasslands. And I watched him apologize on YouTube, watching a video of YouTube. I mean, what a disgusting, stupid mother of a human being. And that's what I'm saying about HIV. Now, I mentioned the culling of 40,000 elephants in, I think, 2 other videos I've done. You can look that up for yourself, how so-called experts, in the end, know absolutely nothing. And I believe this is the case with the whole beginnings of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. There is no more on the initial article. If I wanted to read any more other than the abstract, then I would have to purchase the article. I'm sorry, that's on the lymphotropic retrovirus article. I've only got the abstract, and if I want to read the rest of the report, I have to buy it. So continuing on from the original article on the beginnings, in November 1990, the government, the NIH, wanted to find out what was really going on and who found the virus and where it came from and so forth. So they commissioned an epidemiologist, Sheng-Yung Chang, and he examined archival specimens and concluded in Nature in 1993 that the American sample in fact originated from the French lab. Now this is critical, even though later Montagnier and Gallo worked together. They're claiming that they sent the blood cultures to Gallo, whether it was intentional or accidentally, I don't know. Chang determined that the French group's LAV was a virus from one patient, as I've mentioned many times, that had contaminated a culture from another. Now, as I write down in my bold capitals next, if it's what does that mean, contaminated? On request, Montagnier's group had sent a sample of this culture to Gallo. I don't even know if that's true or actually Gallo stole it. Not knowing it contained 2 viruses. It's a bit hard to believe. It then contaminated the pooled culture in which Gallo was working. So I don't know what's going on. I don't understand all that. But it looks like they've got the same contaminated culture. So they ended up with the same conclusion, apparently, and HIV and AIDS came from that and both of them. But did they have any collusion? Who knows? So they continued to have disputes about who discovered it up until 87, when the President of France and President of America got together and ironed out everything out, and they decided they both discovered it. But what's also interesting is that Montagnier could not claim that it caused AIDS, HIV. So he had to accept that and accept that Gallo and he discovered HIV together. But as I write, why did Montagnier agree to this? I think personally, after doing all this research, that at that time there could have been still some doubts about AIDS being caused by HIV. Anyway, they published a lot of articles together, and I've actually looked at some of them, and they're just, as I write here, these last references, these last 3, 32, 33, and 34, are just fluff pieces, ego-boosting articles only. And then finally, on the 13th of October 1990, Gallo was cleared of stealing the samples and stealing the research by Montagnier. So now we get on to the history of HIV and AIDS in the US. And this is dated 2021, so it's obviously very current. And you can see the headlines, the headings rather, of the different parts of the article. It goes on to say AIDS was first identified in the United States in 81. However, HIV was propagating in the country before that. Of course, the only proofs they show that they even know this on any level is later here. It says in 1984, 3 years trusted source. Now, when you click that and open that particular article, you couldn't trust it as far as you could throw it because there's no backup to it. You can't verify anything in that article. And at that time, they estimate, pre-1980, that there was 100,000 to 300,000 people worldwide living with HIV. And as I write, well, how many are dead? How do they even know they have HIV? I mean, they didn't do a so-called blood test or have a blood test available until a few years later. But how can anyone, researchers estimate, I mean, how? I just don't understand. And you'll find that this is typical in all these videos, that they just make statements like this, saying that, well, they didn't have logarithms then, but basically the same thing as a logarithm. They estimate this from, which I will show you in a little bit, how many people actually had AIDS in New York at that time. So the article goes on. It is believed that HIV-1, the most common form of the virus, spread from chimpanzees to humans no later than 1930. Again, from this company, whoever they are, called Trusted Source. Again, finishing this, most likely during bushmeat trading, hunters would have come into contact with animal blood while hunting chimpanzees, probably in and around Cameroon. So this is the first time somewhere printed that they're claiming, and this was publicized greatly in the 80s, early 80s, mid 80s, that HIV started from monkeys, somehow through bushmeat in the Congo, which comes in later, just below here in the Republic of Congo. Anyway, probably in and around Cameroon, which is right next to the Congo. And I wrote, a joke again. You'll see more on this discovery of how American men, especially, got HIV somehow from monkeys in the Congo. So, researchers have retrospectively discovered HIV in old blood samples. One sample was drawn as far back as 1959 from, again, this company Trusted Source. And here is the next Trusted Source article I have opened up just below, as you can see on the screen. From a man, one man has this blood sample, and I talk about blood samples just below this, that for the blood to be tested for anything, it has to be kept at 4 degrees Celsius for the last 50 years, from 59 up to 2016. There is no way this blood sample could be used for anything. It's just ridiculous. Genetic tracing has shown that HIV has propagated in the United States since the 1970s. So let's look at that article. So these are the highlights from the Nature article. As it says here, for longer storage than 24 hours, blood must be stored at 4 degrees or less centigrade. There's no way the blood was stored for this. at this temperature over the last 50 years. What did someone just put in the fridge and forget about it? Where did it come from? As it says, as I said earlier, from one guy apparently. As I said, it has to be stored for 4 degrees centigrade or less. And we continue the history of AIDS in America. That they also, I don't know who said it first, that that it's a gay-related immunodeficiency virus, whether it was Montagnier or the CDC. So these are the current trends. So in 1982, actually, how they get these numbers again is beyond me, because there is no proof to back up anything. I don't want to say 90% of these articles, but so much of these articles, there's no backup to prove that anything that in these articles that you can prove is correct. Between June 1st, 81 and September 15th, 82, CDC received reports. How would they? Reports of what? Immunity deficiency. I have immunity deficiency. Everybody on this planet has immunity deficiency. It just depends on what degree you have immunity deficiency. I'm going to die of immunity deficiency, and I hope it's going to be old age, because all my cells have died. I will become immune deficient. So what is it that made them aware of these 593 cases? What immune deficiency did they have? What caused it? Did they trace it? The answer is no, 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 and no. Death occurred in 243 cases. What did they die of? Where are the death certificates? It turns out 51% had pneumocystis carinii pneumonia without Kaposi's syndrome. 30% had Kaposi's syndrome, with or without a certain percentage of, I don't know what OOI means, but anyway. So these people, 593 cases, like they're super sick. Kaposi's sarcoma, I mean, you can easily die of that on its own. And we all know how deadly pneumonia is. So they're all very, very sick. And 41% died. But where is all the data that we can say what caused their death? Blood tests. Not even blood tests, I mean, how many people were checked for anything else, or any other diseases they may have had? Were any autopsies done? In 82, CDC published a case definition. Here we go, trusted source again, the 4th time. Called the condition AIDS. This title is from the trusted source above. Current trends, prevention of acquired AIDS, report of interagency recommendations. So they know nothing about it, and yet they're doing this interagency recommendations. So since June 1981, and this is, now we're talking in 82 sometime, AIDS has been reported to CDC from 34 states, DC, and 15 countries. Reported cases of AIDS include persons with Kaposi's sarcoma. In other words, they are really, really sick. They are immune deficient, extremely high immunity deficient. In 83, trusted source again. There's a certain group, what was called the 4H Club. People with haemophilia, homosexual men, heroin users, and Haitians. I will get to the Haitians part later. More trusted source articles. If you read one of these trusted source articles, you'll realize that there is no proof in them. There were 364 cases of diagnosed of AIDS in the US. All you can say is, yes, they were immunity deficient. 1292 people died. That's like over 40%, 42%, whatever. And this is interesting because this is what did happen, I recall clearly. The number of cases continued to grow as the CDC refined their case definition and scientists learned more about the condition. They kept moving the goalposts as soon as they learned more and more about people were dying, so they included different definitions or different parts of what people were dying of, like the CDC count kept dropping and dropping, and now it's anything below 200. You have HIV 100%. And as I write, death by immunity deficiency. So what were people dying of before AIDS came along? And if you trust anything from this trusted source review or any other review, and I've reviewed, I don't know, 100 so-called scientific articles at this stage, where's the proof? So now we get into more detail, the history of HIV and AIDS. My best at trying to do it in a chronological order. So this is one of the articles that I mentioned at the beginning that will be in the description that you can read. It is the best article to read that explains the myths behind HIV and AIDS in as much as in layman terms as possibly this guy could. And he's a microbiologist, and he wrote it in 95, so it's 12 years later. And I go into this article, this particular article in great depth in the next video. But I include this because an era of the past, cancer caused by viruses, which was one of the first things that the discoverers of HIV and AIDS stated about they took the sample from the lymph nodes, someone who had cancer, and they were trying to somehow then connect cancer with the virus. The idea that these postulated viruses caused cancer quickly became hot news the world over, but did not survive investigation, and other explanations were sought. The theory did not predict or explain the dramatic increase in cancer cases, so cancer could not be shown to be transmissible, nor could it suggest any remedy in the form of a vaccine. Interestingly, the spread of cancer viruses was blamed on homosexuals, prostitutes, and black people, just as AIDS came to be 13 years later. So he's referring to the cancer from 1970, and he says 13 years later into 1983. So they were blaming these people that were getting cancer to homosexual, prostitutes, and black people. And interestingly enough, 13 years later, initially, as you'll see in my following report, that they also blamed the same group of people for causing the virus to spread. Of course, there's no mention of how these people got the virus in the first place, but we'll look into it as right now. I write in very large capitals, you can see, Reading these following pages in Wikipedia is the same as watching one of those epidemic virus zombie infected movies. Zero logic, and I mean zero. You find the answer you are looking for, and I suggest you focus on the language and the words to confirm their beliefs before and after they draw their conclusions. So this is the article, and you can, hopefully I haven't missed any references to anything I have posted on my videos or talk about. So we have a lovely photo of HIV-1, and that's one, I believe it's one of the original ones from that blood taken from the one person. And it starts off immediately, AIDS is caused by a human immunodeficiency virus, which originated in non-human primates in Central and West Africa. So this is the first part, and it gets worse. This is just the beginning. Proof. I write proof. So now they're going to try and prove it. So it's saying the specific strain, the one HIV-1, which Montagnier discovered, originally came in the 1920s. HIV-1 is the most virulent of the two, and it's the one that caused the vast majority of HIV globally. And this HIV-1 is closely related. It's not the same. It's closely related to a virus found in chimpanzees, Cameroon, Gabon, Republic of Congo, all in Central West Africa. So it goes on. HIV-1 from chimpanzees and gorillas to humans. It starts off again with this absolute unproved, illogical statement. Scientists generally accept. There are thousands of scientists around the world that don't agree for almost any part of this HIV/AIDS epidemic. People like Dr. Duisberg, which I'll talk about more in the next videos, has been a denialist from day one, saying it's just absolute rubbish and not scientifically based on anything and proven in any way. But he does think there could be some logic to HIV, but he's saying that we all have HIV, and this could be true, but it is not dangerous, and it lives inside of us, and it's been living inside of us forever. We have inside us many viruses that we live with, and they stay dormant, non-active, and do not affect our lives in any way. But most scientists even debunk the whole Montagnier theory on HIV anyway. But it goes on. Scientists generally accept that the known strains for groups of HIV-1 are most closely related to the simian monkey immunodeficiency viruses, endemic in wild ape populations of West and Central Africa. And references 4 and 5. I don't know if I definitely looked at them, but I don't see any comment on it. So it goes on. So now there's, which was the initial location or place where HIV came from, was from monkeys in East Africa, because it's similar, the virus strains. Now, it also goes on, the pandemic strain, the main one, and a rare strain found only in a few Cameroonian people. So, of course, they're trying to confuse us by saying that there's, I think, 5 different strains of HIV-1 now. So here we go. Finally, the primate ancestor of HIV-1 group O, a strain infecting 100,000 people, mostly from Cameroon, but also from neighbouring countries, was confirmed in 2006 to be the simian virus GOR, reference 8. And that group N mostly is the SIV-CPZ one collected from rainforests in Cameroon near the Sangha River. Now remember, they are not identical. How they, again, 100,000 people, there's no backup, no proof, nothing, zero. Thus, this region is presumably where the virus was first transmitted from chimpanzees to humans. However, reviews of the epidemiological evidence of early HIV infection in stored blood samples and of, remember that one old case in Central Africa, have led many scientists to believe that HIV group M, the main one, early human center was probably not in Cameroon, but rather further south in the DRC, then the Belgian Congo, more probably in the capital, in its capital city, now known as Kinshasa. As I said, this article gets worse and worse. So, at least it says, it just repeats from what I said right from the beginning. But now it says pneumonia, one of the pneumonia strains, was found in 5 homosexual men in Los Angeles. 5 men. How did they get? No, I'll correct it. They're just saying right now they have pneumonia. Over the next 18 months, more PCP clusters were discovered among otherwise healthy men in cities throughout the country, along with opportunistic diseases such as Kaposi's sarcoma and persistent generalized lymphadenopathy, common in immunosuppressed patients. So, there's no mention of HIV there. They are immunity deficient, all these people, these 5 homosexual men. So, what caused it? There's no research to tell us how it was caused. And remember, also later, especially in the next video, I talk much more about Kaposi's sarcoma, which is a lot of gay men acquired that because of the high drug use they were doing, and especially nitrates. A lot of people who do nitrates end up with Kaposi's sarcoma. But then, and persistent generalized lymphadenopathy, which again, cancer, which is so easily debunked. Now, as I say here, it's all spelled out, but no, they don't follow the logic and the reasoning to do more research on these five homosexual men. So in June 82, this is before Montagnier, so suggested that a sexually transmitted infectious agent might be the etiological agent. So it suggested the syndrome was then again termed GRID, for gray-related immune deficiency. So then you talk about just picking a sample of, remember, 5 people, and how they are trying to blame it on the gay community. I remember back in the mid-80s, they were trying to just put gay men, trying to blame them for the epidemic. So the same opportunistic infections were also reported among hemophiliacs, users of intravenous drugs such as heroin and Haitian immigrants, which we'll get to later. So, other than the Haitian immigrants, I mean, these are all immunity deficient people. They're dying of something. But what are they really dying of was what always has been the real question. So how did all these people, it seems like this community of all these people, I mean, how did they all meet? Did they all have sex with each other? I mean, how did the virus go from one group to another group, or even between themselves? And so even in this article, under emergence, unresolved questions about HIV origins and emergence. However, some loose ends remain. Wow. It is not yet explained why only 4 HIV groups, MO and AB, spread considerably in human populations, despite bush meat practices being widespread in Central and West Africa, and the resulting human SIV infections being common. They're not human SIV infections. S is for simian, it's the monkey infection. But they're saying they don't know what to do about it. They don't understand it. It also remains unexplained why all epidemic HIV groups emerged in humans nearly simultaneously around 1980, I assume they're saying. Despite very old human exposure to SIV, a 2010 phylogenetic genetic study demonstrated that SIV is at least tens of thousands of years old. In other words, there's been a virus similar to HIV in monkeys for over thousands and thousands of years. So here's the article on simian immunodeficiency virus. This is what they were telling us all over the news back in the mid-80s. So now it's called a retrovirus. And I go into description of retroviruses also. So simian immunodeficiency virus, in other words, monkeys, and there's 45 species in non-human primates. Now, this is also interesting why I put it here. Based on analysis of strains found in 4 species of monkeys from Bioko Island, which was isolated from the mainland by rising sea levels about 11,000 years ago, it has been concluded that SIV has been present in monkeys and apes for at least 32,000 years and probably much longer. So how did the SIV from Bioko Island get on into the monkeys in Cameroon and so forth? So at least it says here. It doesn't say it, but how did it get there? So now it tries to explain it. Several of the theories of HIV origin accept the established knowledge that HIV and SIV phylogenetic relationships, but not identical, and also accept that bushmeat practice was the most likely cause of the initial transfer to humans. Then how did humans everywhere else other than the Belgian Congo get HIV? Never ever explain how that virus got from bushmeat eaten in the Congo, let alone get off the island, the Bioko Island. But they're going to try to right here. Now they're saying that they're to help it to adapt to the human organism by mutation. So the virus now has mutated already. So I write, how did it get from bushmeat practice to any other place on the planet? It's not airborne like COVID-19. A guy cannot get on a plane or a boat who has the virus in the Congo and go and infect 5-6 gay men in New York City. He'd have to have sex with every one of them. So now they're saying it is suggested in 2008, genetic studies, that the M group, the main one, started in Kinshasa in 1910. How do they prove that? They're saying it was caused, the epidemic was caused by, in 1910, by colonialism and the growth of African cities, and this led to social changes, a high degree of non-monogamous sexual activity, the spread of prostitution, and the concomitant high frequency of genital ulcer diseases such as syphilis in nascent colonial cities. I mean, how could anyone even write this stuff? Everyone would be dead then in the Congo, the way they talked about in the mid-80s, that you couldn't have sex anymore because you could get HIV and you would die. So why did millions of people die in those areas in West Africa? And also now, genital ulcers and syphilis now cause HIV. It gets worse. In 2014, from Oxford University and in Belgium, claiming that because approximately 1 million people every year would flow through the prominent city of Kinshasa, which serves as the origin of the first known HIV cases in the 1920s, of course. You can write that as many times as you like, it doesn't make it true. Passengers riding on the region's Belgian railway trains were able to spread the virus to large areas. So, they must have given each other blood transfusions or rituals, or they had sex on the trains, and that's how millions of people got HIV and then spread it all over the world. The study also identifies a roaring sex trade, unsterilized needles used in health clinics. Millions of people. I joke. Okay. Reference 1 in this study, in this article. Origin of pandemic was 1920s Kinshasa. And here it is here. But because it is a BBC article, you can't get it. So here is another article published in Africa, it looks like, written by the Namibian, 2014. You'll notice in a lot of these articles, especially like these in the beginning, they all say exactly the same thing without adding any additional proof or verification of any sort. 1920s Kinshasa, perfect storm of population growth, sex and railways allowed HIV to spread. Roaring sex trade, health clinics, unsterilized needles. Then why aren't millions of people dead? HIV came to global attention in the 1980s and has since infected nearly 75 million people. Then where are all the dead people? Okay, so now the third reason. Haiti. So after they try to convince us between the monkeys and the bushmeat and the sex trade and the needles in Kinshasa, now we've got to the third one, and that is Haiti. There was a lot of articles about Haiti in the mid-80s, late 80s, that It was brought over from Haiti, and you'll see later in this article how they believe the Haitians brought it from the Congo back to Haiti, and then the Haitians went to New York and had sex with all the gay men, and that's how they got it. So there are many risk factor groups for HIV infection in Haiti, with the most common ones including lowest socioeconomic status, low education levels, risky behavior, and low levels of awareness regarding HIV and its transmission. Well, maybe all the Haitians were just sick and their immune system was also shot. Oh, and then it pats itself on the back saying the HIV epidemic has decreased despite the extreme poverty afflicting a large Haitian population, and the controversy surrounding how the virus spread to Haiti in the United States. But Haiti is on the way to controlling it and getting AIDS treatment. So this is how they claim. You can read more and more about Haiti, but where is it? So I write, so is this article saying that since there were no antiretroviral treatments, but there was poverty, etc., then HIV spread anyway? So again, why didn't Haiti have the whole country wipe out and die of AIDS? They didn't get the drugs. So, but above it states that infections engaged dropped to 1%, the previous few passages, so you can't have it both ways. It says that there's a high prevalence rate in gay men, and yet it's saying now it's dropped to 1%. So I don't understand it. And it says here, in Haiti, the three groups where HIV/AIDS is most prevalent are men who have sex with men, sex workers, and prisoners. In other words, people who use a lot of drugs. So now it talks about the Haitians when they went to the US, and that 34 cases of immunodeficient patients were Haitian. So initially they say they were part of the 4H group, but now they're saying that they've been erroneously labeled. I don't know why. I'm sorry, were they or were not part of 4H? But this is the interesting part. That in the 60s, apparently the Belgian Congo imported experts, well-educated experts, 4,500 into Haiti. And it even says, the stupidity of this again, one of them may have carried HIV back across the Atlantic in the 1960s. First of all, how many Haitians were well educated? And they're saying 4,500. I mean, how many Haitians were there in 1962 to start? And they were so highly educated and expert in what? And so one of them brought it back to Haiti and then infected that group of people, and then they brought it over to America. And that's how those 5 gay men got it, from these Haiti people. And then it tries to argue, Pepin argues that its spread in Haiti was spread by poor Haitians in need of money selling their blood plasma at centres such as Hemo Caribbean, which was known to have poor hygienic practices. And as I write, then why aren't all the Haitians dead, if that is true? Okay, finally, you can't talk about all the articles and the media and what they were talking about, where AIDS came from, HIV came from, even the initial discovery, the beginnings, when you can't talk about, and you must talk about what happened in South Africa from the late 80s into the late 90s. Because I recall very clearly that when in the mid-80s, late 80s, maybe well into the 90s, Africa were not doing any blood tests to determine if you had HIV. If you had 5 symptoms, things like fever, diarrhea, malnutrition in some way, and I can't think of the other 2, then you had HIV, and that's how they determined if you had HIV in Africa. There was no blood test. And even the blood tests, as Dr. Stefan Lanka says in his 1995 article, that the tests are actually programmed depending on the company that programs the test, what they're actually looking for, and what percentage of whatever they find they will detect. And as I go, and I mention this in all the videos, and especially in the one about the drugs, is that there were many companies making these tests, blood tests, but today there's only one company that makes the blood test. And I tried to find more information on this company and I can't. I know they're in the Philippines, I know their name, but I can't find any information about how they've programmed the blood test that you can do on yourself. So, they talk about the crisis in South Africa. In this article is written in 2019. But what's interesting is that the President Mbeki, and I go on and on about President Mbeki actually was a total denialist of the whole HIV/AIDS issue, problem, and I've cut and pasted this article here, and how Mbeki refused to, or didn't, sorry, he held a few conferences and he invited people from both sides of the fence, including Dr. Duisberg, and many people that believed in the HIV/AIDS connection and epidemic. And he had 2 conferences, and he concluded with his government and experts within the government that they didn't believe in it. And the uproar it caused internationally, if you can go back and find the articles in the newspapers, it was unbelievable how the sensationalism and how much they were ostracizing Mbeki for not allowing drugs into the country, and that he caused 300,000 or 400,000 people to die unnecessarily. But remember, in '87, AZT was the only drug approved, but even within a few years later, AZT was considered very, very dangerous and ineffective, and in fact, in and of itself, it was killing people. And they were trying to sell these drugs to South Africa. Mind you, the full treatment was $8,000 per person. So how in the hell were they ever going to afford, a country like South Africa afford that anyway? Anyway, these are the notes from that article. I write, all the above has a strong validity and does show many factors why Mbeki initially refused to allow AZT into South Africa. There was also extensive international media propaganda to try and force and coerce Mbeki to accept AZT and other unproven drugs that fight HIV. The cost was also a major contributing factor. AZT has been totally debunked, and I have a section to prove this. All the anti-AZT people were always 100% correct. So this goes into the history of, from 1997, how Mbeki just refused to accept the Western notion of HIV and AIDS. So even one reference here, 22, was just a fluff piece, only criticising Mbeki and his policies, no proof of anything. Mbeki always insisted that HIV is caused by poverty, hygiene, lack of fresh food, and lack of medical attention, all caused by apartheid. And I've always felt that has been true also. So it goes more on the history. You can see from the dates, April, March 2000, so Mbeki sent a 5-page personal letter to Bill Clinton that how he felt about AIDS, and that it was in fact the persecution of the denialists, and because to the people, because they were black, and they were trying to force sort of like a white man's medicine on black South Africa. Anyway, what's interesting though, more so, is that Clinton leaked the letter. That asshole Clinton, he leaked the letter to make Mbeki look stupid, dumb, and embarrass him, to try and force him to change course and take the drugs. In the end, there's no article I found, but I recall that Mbeki did end up agreeing, because all the other funds that South Africa would receive from international sources, mainly from the US, would be cut off if he didn't accept the drugs. So this is about the scientists meeting and the advisory panel all the way, and how they're claiming so many 100,000 people have died because he didn't bring in the drugs earlier. And this after Mbeki left. Dr. Duisberg published another article in 2009 saying, of course, that there was still yet no proof that HIV causes AIDS. Anyway, it just finishes off here about Mbeki, and I write, everything above really is about trying to shut all dissent and have any discussion or proof about the epidemic. Finally, my first video will finish in another few minutes, but we have to talk about this young boy called Kosi Johnson, because he was the poster boy for HIV AIDS in South Africa and even internationally. So here's his photo, obviously looking malnutrition and quite sick, and was a South African child with HIV and AIDS, which of course was never shown to anyone, any blood tests. Did he ever have a blood test? Who knows? Was he ever checked that he was sick of anything else? No, nothing was ever published on his mental or physical health at any time. So in late 2000, after returning from a trip abroad to the United States, Johnson began feeling unwell. Soon after Christmas that year, he collapsed. He was diagnosed with brain damage. He had several seizures and became comatose. He died 6 months later. And of course, he's buried in the best cemetery reserved for all the leaders of South Africa. And he was held up as the poster child to discredit Mbeki in every way possible to accept the drugs. So I looked up seizure disorders. It's quite prevalent in 2 to 14 years old. And there's another article on seizures in children. And seizures are an abnormal, unregulated electrical discharge of nerve cells in the brain or in part of the brain. This abnormal discharge can cause convulsions, involuntary movements, altered awareness, abnormal sensations. So what did he die of? Because there was nothing published that even if he had HIV, there was no published blood test. There was no other test done on him. It wasn't like there was an autopsy done on him because he was already dying of AIDS. And he was the poster boy. And in fact, he was paraded all over the world, especially in South Africa, in the media there, and also in the US. He was perfect, he was young, eloquent, and I remember hearing him talk. And he was purely there for public perception and to pull emotional springs to force Mbeki to take the drugs. And I wrote jokingly, like most Steven Spielberg movies, I've only really liked 2 of his movies. His first one, which was called Duel, and a later one about the Munich Olympic Games massacre. So I have included this is how the HIV test was invented in 2016. And it talks about now there's an International Testing Day, as you may or may not know. I didn't know. And it talks about the original test and how the test kept on improving because when they were testing people that they thought had HIV, then it didn't prove that way, so they kept changing the test. So it include different parameters of what they were testing and what percentage of whatever they wanted to find in the blood would be indicated. And as it says in this article, these early tests weren't actually designed to diagnose patients with AIDS or HIV. Instead, they were designed to screen donated blood for possible infections. Now, in this Time magazine, how do they know this if they just got the test kits? Because they just made the test kits around 1985 anyway. And as of today, there is only one, as I mentioned, one company making the test. And why? Because I think because the tests were not all-encompassing enough to prove that so many people that were sick and had immunity deficiencies were dying of HIV. Because the first tests were intended to ensure blood donations would not transmit the virus, they were very sensitive and so had a high rate of false positive results. And they keep, as I said, changing the design of the test until they were getting the tests they wanted. The results they wanted. And interestingly, in the Smithsonian Museum of American History, it explains in its documentation of the ELISA test, one of the first tests, the test kit had a label, and it said, "It is inappropriate to use this test as a screen for AIDS or as a screen for members of groups at increased risk for AIDS in the general population. The presence of HTLV3 antibody is not a diagnosis of AIDS." In addition to these medical questions and the high false positive rate, early HIV tests were surrounded by the real threat of stigma and discrimination. So, in the beginning, you can see they kept changing the test because it wasn't getting the results. Positive, negative, positive, negative. So you didn't know anything about what was really going on because the tests weren't designed, and they kept getting changed to widen the parameters to get the results they wanted. New protocols were added, like retesting positive results. Even today, if you get a negative today, they always recommend you do another test. If you get a positive today, you still have to do another test. The minimum test is 2. So reading this article, it sounds like you're listening to Trump talk about COVID-19. And the article goes on. By March of the following year, the government had issued a recommendation that people in all high-risk groups undergo periodic testing to determine if they were infected with the virus. And when Time reported on the change, that recommendation wasn't the only AIDS news covered. The article mentioned a promising study that indicated that an experimental drug, ACT, improved patients' immune systems. The FDA approved AZT in 1987, and it was the first drug to combat AIDS. And it is pure poison, and it killed almost everyone that used it. They stopped using it, I believe, just only a few years later when they realized the mistake they made. But there's a great article from Spin Magazine that's included in the description on the beginning of this that gives a history of how AZT approves and its real repercussions. And as I write, how many people died because of this treatment? We will never know. So that's all from the first one. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will get on to the second one. See you soon. Thanks. Bye.